Here is the least we need to know for the bar exam essays for free speech. First of all, I want you to start all essays on freedom of speech with the following sentence. The First Amendment protects freedom of expression, including free speech, of the press, of assembly, and association. So the First Amendment protects what? Freedom of, that's right, expression, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and of, that's right, association. The First Amendment protects freedom of expression, including freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly, and association. All right, try to repeat it out loud. The First Amendment protects what? Freedom of, that's right, expression, including freedom of speech, that's right, freedom of the press, that's right, freedom of assembly, that's right, and freedom of association. Good. Okay, so protected speech is our first category. Protected speech comes in two flavors, content-based and content-neutral. A content-based restriction is where the government seeks to restrict speech because of its content, its subject matter, or its viewpoint. And it is subject to strict scrutiny, narrowly tailored to a compelling government interest. Okay, let's talk about this first category again. Content-based is what? When the government seeks to restrict speech based on, that's right, it's content. It's one, subject matter, or two, viewpoint. And it's subject to what level of scrutiny? Strict scrutiny. The law will not survive unless it passes strict scrutiny, narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling governmental interest. Now we have our content neutral restriction. And this is where the government just applies the restriction to all expression, like all billboards. Okay, so this is usually going to come up in the context of a time, place, and manner restriction or speech on government property. But the main thing to remember is you can recognize a content neutral restriction. It just applies to everyone, regardless of the content, regardless of the viewpoint, and it's subject to intermediate scrutiny. Okay, so we've got our protected speech, content-based, strict scrutiny, content neutral, intermediate scrutiny. Okay, let's go into these a little tiny bit more. Okay, so for content neutral restrictions, we have public forums, which can be designated, limited, and then we have our non-public forums. Okay, a public forum is a piece of government property that's traditionally open for speech. What are we talking about? The streets, the sidewalks, the public parks. So public forum is government property, which is what? That's right, traditionally open for speech. A designated public forum. It's a piece of government property that the government opens for expressive use. For example, a public library meeting room, designated public forum, government property that they could close it to speech, but they opened it for expressive use. So we've got our public forum. Any content neutral restriction can be in a public forum, designated public forum. Then we have our limited public forums. So this is government property that's limited to certain groups or dedicated to the discussion of certain topics. And non-public forums. Remember, if it's a non-public forum, That's government property that's closed to speech. It doesn't mean private. If it's non-public, we're talking about things like the airport or a military base. That's a non-public forum. The government can and does close those forums to speech. Do we want freedom of speech on a military base or the airport? Probably not. Okay, so what are our 4 types of forums? 1, that's right, a public forum. 2, that's right, a designated public forum. 3, that's right, a limited public forum. And 4, a non-public forum. Okay, so remember, all of our content-based regulations, no matter where, they have to pass strict scrutiny. But for anything that's content neutral, we're going to look at what gets intermediate scrutiny and what gets rational basis review. Okay, so our first 2, number 1, that's right, public forum. Number 2, designated public forum. Subject and viewpoint neutral, and it gets intermediate scrutiny. Important interest, leaving alternative channels of communication, leaving open alternative channels of communication. Okay, so that's our public forum or our designated forum get intermediate scrutiny. Then we've got our other 2, limited public forum, non-public forum. Here our regulation has to pass rational basis review. So the plaintiff has to show that it's not reasonably related to a legitimate government purpose. And it has to be viewpoint neutral. Okay, so that was a lot. Just remember this, a content-based restriction is a restriction on subject or viewpoint, got to satisfy strict scrutiny. If it's a content neutral restriction, then it's either has to satisfy intermediate scrutiny or rational basis review. Intermediate scrutiny, public forum, designated public forum. Rational basis, limited public forum, non-public forum. Okay, quiz. Which 2 forums get intermediate scrutiny? Number 1 and number 2, public forum, designated public forum. Which 2 gets rational basis? That's right, limited public forum and non-public forum. Okay, what's intermediate scrutiny? An important interest, leaving open alternative channels of communication. And what's rational basis again? Rationally related to a legitimate government purpose. Okay, this is actually the most complicated thing when there's a content neutral restriction. Remember, the government may regulate the time, place, and manner depending on the forum. We've got our 4 forums: public, designated public, limited public, and non-public. Number 1 and number 2 get intermediate. Number 3 and number 4 get rational basis. Okay, let's get into exceptions to freedom of speech. There's unprotected speech and there's lesser protected speech. Let's talk about unprotected speech first. Okay, speech that advocates violence, fighting words, obscene speech, defamation. All of that is unprotected speech. Speech that advocates violence, speech that incites overthrow of the government, speech that constitutes fighting words like, let's go get that guy, he's a communist. Obscenity, so appealing to the prurient interest in sex. Defamatory, defaming someone. We know what defamation is. It's a false statement published to a third party, and we have different standards for a public figure. We'll get to that. Okay. Now, so that's our unprotected speech. Unprotected speech advocates what? Violence, lawlessness, fighting words, words by their very utterance incite illegal activity. Obscenity, appealing to the prurient interest in sex. Defamation, a false statement purporting to be fact published to a third party. And if it's a public figure, trust me, we're getting to that. Okay, that gives us unprotected speech. What about lesser protected speech? We have three categories: the government and public employees, commercial speech, and the public schools. Let's talk first about the public schools because it's easier to remember. Public school students get lesser freedom of speech protection. The regulated speech has to materially and substantially interfere with the operation of the school. That's our standard for First Amendment protection. Materially and substantially interferes with the operation of the school. So, lesser protected speech, category 1, public school, materially and substantially interferes with operations of the school. Category number 2, commercial speech. What's not protected? False and deceptive advertising. If it's regulated, commercial speech has to serve a substantial government interest, directly advance the interest, and not be more extensive than necessary. Okay, now, highly tested government and public employees. If you are an employee and you're making a statement pursuant to your official duties, that is not protected speech. But what about, it's why? Because it's government speech. The First Amendment doesn't apply. But what about an employee of the government made as a private citizen on a matter of public concern? There's wide protection to the employer's judgment. If it's a public concern, it's not protected speech. If it is of public concern, newsworthy, political, whatever, we're going to balance the employee's rights as a citizen against the government interest in promoting the efficiency of public service. So we've got unprotected speech, violence, fighting words, words by which their very utterance incite to illegal activity, obscenity, appealing to the prurient interest in sex, defamation, false statement purporting to be fact, published to a third party, harms someone's reputation. Then we've got our lesser protected speech, public schools. Does it materially and substantially interfere with school operations? Commercial speech, false and deceptive advertising isn't protected, but truthful communication is protected. So if the government wants to regulate advertising or commercial speech, it has to serve a substantial government interest, directly advance that interest, and be no more extensive than necessary. If you want to say rational basis review for commercial speech, that's probably good enough. So the regulation has to serve a substantial government interest and be no more extensive than necessary. The thing to remember about commercial speech is that if it's true, it's protected. But if it's false and deceptive, it's not protected. The government wants to regulate it. What level of scrutiny does it have to pass? Basically, rational basis review. You're right. The regulation has to serve a substantial government interest. Can it be really extensive? Can you super regulate commercial advertising? Well, yes, of course you can. The government can regulate cigarette advertising, alcohol advertising, all kinds of advertising, just no more extensive than necessary. When you think about commercial speech, think about regulating speech like in the 90s, the Camel ads that encouraged kids to smoke, or the fact that we don't see cigarette ads on television anymore, but we do see alcohol ads. The government can regulate commercial speech so long as it is truthful and it passes rational basis review and it's no more extensive than necessary. Okay, Public school students, easy. What do we have? The regulated speech would materially and substantially interfere with the operation of the school. How about commercial speech? What's protected? That's right, truthful communication. Is false and deceptive advertising protected? Heck no. And if it's truthful, what level of review do we need to pass? That's right, rational basis review. The regulation must serve a substantial government interest and be no more, that's right, extensive than necessary. Now let's talk about government and public employees. Private citizen, matter of public concern. If it is of public concern, the employee has a right to speak as a citizen that's balanced against the government's interest in public service. This makes sense if you are a senator and you're speaking as a private citizen on taxes in your hometown, then your freedom of speech is balanced against your rights as a citizen to free speech against the government interest. And the government has to have an adequate justification for treating you, Ms. Senator, differently than any regular citizen. Now, what if it's not protected? What if it's not public concern? There's a great deal of deference to the employer's judgment. Okay, think about tweets from President Trump. Those are not protected speech if they are not of public concern. So if he just says this guy is an asshole, that's not public concern. But if he's tweeting on matters pertaining to the government, there's going to be wide deference to employer. In this case, I'm glad we got rid of him, but there's going to be wide deference to the employer's judgment. Okay. And that is everything you need to know about freedom of speech for the First Amendment for the bar exam.